Good afternoon and welcome to NKDO's first expert interview webinar. We're here today at the offices of the National Kidney Registry with Garet Hil, the founder and CEO of the NKR. Garet's a donor himself, having donated his kidney in 2015 through the voucher program on behalf of his daughter. We'll talk for about 30 minutes and then open the discussion to questions from our viewers. Please put your question in the chat, and hopefully we'll be able to get to most or all of them. Before we begin, I want to note that NKR is a benefactor of the NKDO and provides funding for the Donor Mentor program, which supports all of the donor candidates that register to donate through the NKR public websites. So Garet, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
You're welcome.
We'd like to start by hearing some of the background about how and why you and your wife started the National Kidney Registry.
Well, let me start by congratulating you for achieving the milestone of 100,000 members for NKDO.
Well, thank you. But we're up over 1,100 now and growing.
Wow, that's phenomenal.
Yeah.
So the NKR started in 2007, and the reason my wife and I started the NKR is that our daughter lost her kidney function when she was 10 years old. And when she lost her kidney function, it didn't take long to research it and figure out that the best path forward was a living donor transplant, versus dialysis or deceased donor transplant. So we didn't know anything about transplant at the time. And everything we learned, we pretty much looked up online. It was pretty obvious early on that my wife couldn't donate because she was a blood type B and Samantha was a blood type A. So she was blood type incompatible. I was a blood type A, Samantha was blood type A. So I was blood type compatible. And I started the workup process at Cornell to donate. And I think it was like April or May of 2007. And during that period of time, our daughter, who was very sick, when she started this process, she went on dialysis. It appears that her immune system came back online and she started creating antibodies because she'd gotten 2 units of blood in the hospital. So she became sensitized. So I passed the first couple cross-match tests. And then the day before surgery, I failed the final cross-match. And so they had to cancel the surgery and we were, shaking our heads, what do we do now? At the time, she had about an 80% CPRA, which means she would fail 80% of the cross matches against the general public, which, that's actually not very sensitized. So when that happened, we did 2 things. We started to look for donors that would be compatible for it. We launched a donor search campaign. And at the same time, we entered our pair we tried to go into every paired exchange in the United States. There was about a dozen at the time, and we actually made it into 2 of those paired exchange programs, and they never found a match. And as we were going through this process, I kept looking at the math saying, 80% CPRA, that's not a very high CPRA. If you had 5 people in a pool, odds are you'd find a match. Why aren't they finding a match? And back in those days, paired exchange was sort of like, it was a, we'll call it research outgrowth of a couple transplant centers, and there wasn't a national program knitting all the programs together. And this was a math problem. The more volume you got in, the faster you could match and the better the matches would be. And so we tried it, it didn't work. And we went through the process and we kept thinking that there needs to be a national paired exchange program to solve this problem, because we were being impacted by the problem, but we knew, you could look at the numbers, thousands of people were being impacted by the exact same problem. They had a compatible donor, or they had an incompatible donor, a living donor, and they couldn't get transplanted. So we finally found a compatible donor for our daughter. She got transplanted in 2007. And after that, we decided we'd take a shot at solving the problem. And that's when we founded the National Kidney Registry, and we founded it to solve the problem that we faced when our daughter lost her kidney function. And we're 15 years later now, and we have essentially eliminated the problem of an incompatible donor.
But go back, when did you actually donate yourself? You didn't.
So I donated in 2015. So I was not able to donate back in 2007. My nephew donated. He was the one
I
that
see.
was
Okay.
compatible. And then I always thought that it would be very valuable if I could donate my kidney on behalf of my daughter, because at the time I was in my, let's say, early 50s. And, you get to a certain age and you can't donate anymore. And it just seemed like, why not be able to donate now to create a voucher for somebody before you age out, right? And so I always wanted to create this program, and originally we called it advanced donation, but it took many years to build the volume and to build the confidence of our medical board to get behind a program like that. And so the first voucher donor donated in 2014. I was the second voucher donor in 2015. So that was the beginning of our push toward the voucher program, which is now expanded into standard voucher and family voucher, and over 50% of the donors coming through the NKR are now voucher donors.
I've seen the screens of the donors and the patients, and tried to get a sense of the matching issues that you go through, and you do this yourself, correct? You do the matches yourself? How did you learn this?
Yeah, so I do it myself, but there are people in this organization trained to back me up, and we test that all the time, but I am the primary matcher. And so it evolved. It was a series of innovations over time, right? So in the very early days, the first matching system that we built, we actually gave the matches to the transplant center and had them select the cluster that they went to. So the first cluster that went to surgery at Cornell in 2008, that was selected by Cornell. So we hadn't refined the process. We realized once we brought in additional transplant centers, you can't have a transplant center making the match decision, right? You had to make it within the NKR and then put the match offer out. And so it was originally we didn't even send a match offer to the transplant center. We called them on the phone. That was really inefficient. We quickly moved to writing the software to send an email that had the match offer in it. And now it's evolved so that it's an email notification. You click and you go into our website and you look at all the data. So it's evolved a lot over time. In the early days, it was a phone call, which is hard to imagine.
Wow. Okay. Well, you've come a long way. Why don't you give us a sense of the scope of NKR's activities now? How many transplant centers do you work with? And how many transplants did you facilitate in 2021?
So actually, this week or next week, we'll send out a press release announcing that we have our 100th transplant center. That's a big deal for us. We've been looking for that for a long time. Yeah. To put it in perspective, at the end of 2010, after let's see, 3 years of matching, we had 40 transplant centers. So the first 40 got on very quickly because these are people who were hungry for this. And then, as time went on, it became harder and harder to bring on new centers. So 40 at the end of 2010, right now, or sometime this week, we'll be up to 100. There are 250 transplant centers in the United States, but many of those centers are so small, they can't really support paired exchange. So our transplant centers represent 64% of the living donor transplants in the United States. So we're working with about 2/3 of the major centers.
And how many transplants did you do in 2021?
So 2021, we finally cracked the 1,000 number. We hit 1,019 transplants. And the other number that we track closely, and this is important to your membership, is we have a product called Donor Shield, which supports and protects living donors who are going through the process. And we protected and supported approximately 1,500 living donors, which is 25% of all US living donors. We want to get that number to 100%, because it's not, in my opinion, it's not fair for donors to go through the donation process and not have, lost wage reimbursement, insurance, and these other things that are, it's not an incentive to donate, but it's reducing the risk and increasing the support of living donations. So 25% of all US living donors went through our Donor Shield platform, and the 1,000 KPD transplants represent 17% of all transplants in the United States.
Okay, well, that 17%, I think, is what I want to take a look at here. Let's take a chart, look at the chart from your quarterly report to see how this compares to past years. There we go. So that's a 31% year-over-year gain in the share of living donations in 2021. To what do you attribute this continuous annual gain in the transplants facilitated by the NKR?
You know, I attribute it to innovation. We're constantly innovating, adding new products, new capabilities. One of the things that's starting to drive the numbers now is we started out trying to solve the incompatible donor problem. My wife and I were incompatible. We knew what that looked like. And it took 10, 15 years to solve that. We have solved that. If you have an incompatible donor, the median wait time to transplant in NKR is 6 weeks, right? That's not a long time. It used to take people a year, and only 10% of people who entered paired exchange even got transplanted. So now we're at 99%, and those people are getting transplanted. The only folks who can't get transplanted are people with 100% CPRAs, but even in those cases, we're getting some of those patients transplanted. So we're constantly innovating, but we're to a point now where we have solved the incompatible donor problem. So now what we're solving is the poor match problem. So we have a product called Kidney for Life, where we do high resolution tissue typing for the donor and recipient. And the goal of that, or the aim of that program, is to improve the match between the donor and recipient so that recipients' transplant lasts longer and they have the opportunity to take less immunosuppressive medication, less side effects. And so we're now expanding this base beyond incompatible living donor pairs. And we have more and more compatible pairs entering the NKR to get a better match. And that is the Kidney for Life program. So I believe that's driving a lot of the growth. I also believe that the Donor Shield program is driving a lot of the growth. Now, we can't really measure it, but we've had, and you've probably had many conversations with donors who said, I want to go to a transplant center that has Donor Shield. I want to be supported and protected. And so we think that that is also causing donor and recipient pairs to shift over to NKR centers so they can get that support and protection.
Well, I think by this point, most of our audience is familiar with Donor Shield, this comprehensive suite of protections for living donors. It's unique to the NKR. Tell us how the combination of remote donation and voucher programs are impacting and transforming the industry.
So the voucher program and remote donation are two separate programs, but they've come together. So originally we created the remote donation program so that a patient who's, say, in Boston and the donor is in San Diego, and that was the first case, by the way, the donor donated at one of our hospitals in San Diego, and we shipped the kidney to Boston, and it was transplanted into the patient in Boston. That was the first remote donation case. I think it was 2017. And that expanded, you know, because not all donors want to fly across the country and spend a week recovery somewhere. It was a convenience to the donor. But then COVID hit, right? And now people were a little more concerned about flying, and we saw the remote donation go way up. And what happened is it went way up, and it's staying up because now the hospitals are starting to think about remote donation and the convenience to the donor. So you've got this trend of remote donation so the donor doesn't have to get on an airplane. And then you have this other trend of voucher, you know, more and more voucher donors. Well, they've come together, and we have this thing called the remote voucher donation, right? So if you know somebody who needs a transplant, let's say, you know, you're in San Diego and that person is in Boston, right? Well, we don't want you to donate your kidney and us to fly it all the way to Boston, because chances are there's probably a 90% probability that it's not a great DNA match or histocompatibility match, right? So we want you to donate and start a chain. So, and your kidney will go to somebody who it is a good, you know, an excellent match for, and then that you give a voucher to your friend or family member in Boston. And then when that person's ready to go to surgery, ready for their transplant, they redeem their voucher, and we're looking around the entire country trying to find the best match for that patient. So the remote donation program and the voucher program have come together, and we're seeing a lot of remote voucher donations, which is a convenience to the donor. The other thing I like about that is when a donor donates through the voucher program, they automatically get all the donor shield protections, including the prioritization protection. If they ever need a living donor kidney, or if they ever need a transplant in the future, they'll get a living donor kidney from the NKR. So it's good for the donor, it's good for the patient gets a better match. The patient goes to surgery when they're ready to go to surgery. There's not really somebody else driving that time frame. And it's good for the transplant centers because it's a lot easier to manage without these long chains.
All right, well, this is a segues into a conundrum that we have at NKDO to some extent. We're donor mentors to not only the donor candidates who come through the NKR, but also to 8 other transplant centers in their private DASH label intake system. And we're often in discussion with folks who are just learning about the process for the first time. They're hearing about it. They came into this process convinced that they want to be a direct donor, that not being a direct donor is somehow making them less of a donor for their loved one. All else being equal, most donors would prefer that they be a direct donor. If they're not the best possible match, however, the recipient is not getting the kidney that's going to last the longest. So my question to you is, how would you explain the trade-offs to such a donor? How would your explanation alter a situation where the donor candidate lived at a long distance from the recipient?
Okay, so there's a couple components to that. One is in having your conversation with the donor, and I have conversations with donors all the time, I simply explain to them that there's, we've done simulations, right? And we know that in the general population, only 11% of donors are great matches to the recipient. The other 89% are not, they're really good matches, better than a deceased donor kidney, better in dialysis, but you can upgrade from there. So 89%, the way we define this, it's called eplet matching. So if you have a low eplet match, right, you're in that 11%. That's a great match, and it's proven. There's 5 research papers out there proving that those kidneys have less de novo DSA, which is the precursor to rejection, which is the precursor to chronic rejection and graft failure, right? So if you have a low eplet mismatch, you're much less likely. It's much less likely that kidney will be rejected, and the numbers on this are pretty remarkable. In the latest Colorado study, they had 440 patients go through this process, and of the high eplet mismatch transplants, 17% created de novo DSA, which is the precursor to rejection. Intermediate, 11%. Low, less than 1%, right? So on the low side, and that one was a patient who didn't take their immunosuppressive medications for 2 weeks. So we don't even know, it's 0, 1%. But if you look at those numbers and you say, what's the impact of that? Well, if you generate de novo DSA, the logical progression of that is what's called chronic rejection and ultimately graft failure. And 63% of living donor transplant patients lose their kidney after year 1 to that issue, this chronic rejection problem, right? So if we can upgrade these matches to low eplet mismatches, we have the potential of eliminating 63% of graft failure. That's a big deal. So back to the donor though, I think that you need to explain to the donor the sort of the math behind this and the impact of a good match versus a not so good match.
Yeah, it's the good enough match point that we find as our biggest challenge, where someone says, well, I think I'm a good enough match, but the implications of that obviously are serious when you're talking about the amount of immunosuppressive drugs you have to take and the expected life expectancy of that kidney.
That's the second issue too. It's not just graft failure or graft longevity. If you have a good match or an excellent match, you have the opportunity to lower immunosuppressive medications. Those immunosuppressive medications have significant side effects. And I'm not going to get into them here, but That's a big deal for the patients,
Yes.
right? So that's sort of one side of this conversation. Now, you can't, here's the other side. You can't really have that conversation with the donor in a meaningful way unless the donor has been tissue typed with high resolution typing and the patient's been typed with high resolution typing, because that donor might be a low eplip mismatch with the recipient. And so we have a handful of centers around the country right now who've implemented what we call the Kidney for Life expert system. And it's a way to measure, to get that tissue typing up front so that early on, you know what kind of match you are. There are plenty of, that 11%, there's plenty of those 11% out there who are excellent matches who should do direct donation, right? So one is you need to have the conversation, but the donor and the patient need to have the information. And that's where we're working with the transplant centers to try to open them up to doing those tests earlier in the process so that the donor actually knows what the match is.
At this point, how many transplant centers are doing that level of testing?
We have 17 centers who can do that level of testing. Those are the participating centers in the Kidney for Life program. We have 4 centers using the expert system, and they're testing every living donor pair that comes through.
Good to know. All right. So as you look to 2022 and beyond, tell us what the NKR has in store to increase both the quantity and the quality of living donor transplants.
So there are 3 major initiatives going on. One will increase the quality of living donor transplants, and the other 2 will increase the number of living donor transplants. So we've already talked about the Kidney for Life program. That's the program that will increase the quality of living donor transplants. And our hope is that that 63% graft failure due to chronic rejection, we can eliminate that or dramatically reduce that. So that's what we're gunning for. And then on the sort of the back end too, we want to reduce those immunosuppression. So that's the quality initiative. On the quantity, increasing the volume of living donor transplants, we have a program called microsites. I'm sure a lot of your members are aware of that, where a patient can come to one of our centers that offer the microsites. They can put up a website customized with their story, and there's a button on there that'll take them right into the donor intake process. We have 8 coaches who coach those patients. We have 1,100 microsite patients now, and we have every one of those is connected to a coach. So just like through your organization, the donor candidates connect to a mentor. In the microsite platform, the patients connect to a coach. And we called them coaches. We were thinking about mentors, then we get really confused. So that microsite platform is very powerful because the coaches have deep experience. These coaches are people who have already done this for a loved one or themselves. They've done a donor search campaign, so they've been personally involved in this. Like my wife and I were, right?
Right.
So they have personal knowledge, and they have coached over 100 patients through to transplant. So they have a very high success rate, and we have very high volume. So if we can combine that high success rate that the coaches have with the high volume of microsites, we think over the next few years, we could add a couple thousand transplants a year to the current 6,000 a year that the industry is sort of stuck at, right? For 20 years.
Yeah.
The second program that we believe will increase the volume, and you guys are very involved in this, and that is that the NKR sends qualified donor referrals to transplant centers on an ongoing basis. So we have probably 15,000 donor candidate registrations on our various websites that come through the same funnel. And then this funnel includes online screening, are you qualified to be a living donor? And then we do a medical history data collection component. And then if you complete that, we send you a script to go to a Quest lab to get your labs drawn. And that process knocks out probably 80 to 90% of the donor candidates, because in the end, a lot of people are kind of doing it online. They're not really committed. But if you go to Quest, you're highly motivated. You're probably going to go through the whole process. And so once we have the lab results, we then let the donor decide what transplant center they want to go to donate. And we send that referral to the transplant center. Last year, we sent 1,600 qualified donor referrals to our transplant center. This year, we're looking at more like 3,000. right? That's a lot of
Yeah,
donors.
it's very much the goal of NKDO to convert as many of those referrals as we can. We'd like to see a doubling of the conversion.
So our conversion rate now, and this isn't from registration to donation, this is from referral.
Yeah.
This is after you've knocked out 80 to 90%. Our conversion rate's only about 8%, which is way too low.
Yeah.
Now, we know it's too low because we have a handful of centers over 20%. And if you look at the distribution of conversion rates across transplant centers, huge variation with a lot of centers down at the bottom at 0%. Well, we know we can do better. So we're initiating a program to develop best practices for the transplant centers so they can raise those conversion rates. If you combine that with NKDO's mentor program, our early data shows that the mentor program is doubling conversion rates, right? So, you know, if you can if the mentor program can double conversion rates in the transplant centers, improve their process, we could get the whole industry over 20%. That would add over time thousands of additional living donor transplants. So that's the second big initiative to increase the number of living donor transplants, is just create a referral process that doesn't lose so many the donor candidates.
Well, we have over 50 donor mentors who are involved in this, and we're very, very excited about the prospect for making a big impact in this year and going forward. We're very excited about it. So the last formal question I have here is one that's near and dear to your heart. This is all near and dear to your heart, but this one maybe even more so. There's a common myth that kidney donation limits the sporting activities of the donor, and the donors cannot partake in endurance activities. How is the NKR helping to abolish that myth?
So let me go back to the origin of this initiative. So this is our Donor Games initiative, and it's morphed into even more stuff. We have sponsored athletes now, but actually the first time I heard of this was a survey that was done in New York State, and I got it secondhand. And I read the survey, and it said 80% of the general population thinks that donating a kidney will permanently impair yourself, your health, your physicality. It's like, wow, that's a huge misperception. So when I saw that, I said, let me test this. Let's go find a market research company. Let's do a national survey. So we repeated that New York survey at a national level. Same number came out, 80%. At a national level, 80% of the general population thought that it would physically impair you if you donated a kidney. And we know that's not true. Right. So, and we actually have a third survey going down right now. We're working with Johns Hopkins Research, and we've made the questions more scientific and whatnot, but it's the same number. Actually, it has dropped a little bit. It's dropped to 75%. And I believe that's due to our efforts.
I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
So
what we've done is about 2 years ago, we launched the Donor Games. And so this is where we invite all different types of, we have 3 categories. We have living donors, we have transplant recipients, and we also have general population. And we put together these online events, and we compete. And then we also have and we had our first championship last year in Greenwich here, where we flew people in, and we were able to compete in person. And we put that out on video format, but the whole purpose of that is to show that donors are not physically damaged from donation. And we've now gone even further, and we have a sponsored athlete group. So a lot of the folks on the call here are probably well aware of the Kilimanjaro climb. So we sponsored a bunch of folks from kidney donor athletes to climb the tallest mountain in Africa. That'll be televised, hopefully. We've got Matt Kavanaugh, who's our first formal sponsored athlete, but we had an informal sponsored athlete before him. But Matt Kavanaugh is going to do 4 of these, just
insane,
crazy races, the desert in the middle of, I don't even know.
250 kilometers in a week.
Where you have to carry your own water.
Yeah, you carry the whole thing.
You don't have a support team. And then I love the one in Antarctica. I didn't realize Antarctica was a desert, but there's an endurance race out of. So Matt's going to show, that he's a kidney donor. He donated about a year ago. He's going to make it through this. Also, David Ashley he was sort of the original sponsored athlete before we even had the name, and he's climbing the tallest mountains in the 7 continents around the world. So he's already climbed Kilimanjaro, and he's got 1 more to go, and then he's going to Mount Everest, right? That's going to be quite a deal.
All right, well, we could spend the rest of the time talking about the athletic part of this, which I know you love. This has been a really informative discussion, and I'd like to turn now to the questions from our viewers. We have quite a few here. This is great. Garet, you mentioned being aged out. What is the age limit to be a living donor?
All right, so that depends on the transplant center and it depends on the individual. I've seen donors donate who are older than 80, right? But those donors, they're in really good health, right? Number one, but they're also at transplant centers who have a lot of confidence, right? So there's 250 transplant centers in the United States, and there's probably only 20 or 30 that do a lot of volume. And the smaller centers are going to end up being a little more conservative. So what we find is that at the higher volume centers who have more of a, I guess an aggressive posture around this, they'll raise that age limit. Like I said, I've seen it go over 80. I've seen people who are in the early 60s get turned down, but a lot of times that's because you got a health issue, right? So I'd say the range is somewhere between 60 and 80.
Okay, all right. If a transplant candidate gets a standard voucher, how long does it take to find a match if the recipient is ready for transplant?
So that's a tricky one because there's a lot of variables that come into play. Our median wait time for a voucher from activation to transplant is something like 8 or 9 weeks, right? The problem with that analysis is that there's a growing number of voucher holders who are going through the Kidney for Life program, and they're looking for a low eplet mismatch, right? So they're going to end up waiting another month or two to get that low eplet mismatch, and that's extending the time for voucher or the completion of the voucher redemption or the transplant for the voucher holder. So if you're being picky about the kidney that you're going to get, you could wait 2 to 3 months before you get transplanted. And then we also you have the patient who may have a very high CPRA. That could take 8 to 10 months, depending on how high their CPRA is. And then blood type matters too. If you're an A blood type, you're going to get matched pretty much immediately because there's a huge number of A donors already in our system and entering the system that can't find a match. So it just depends on a lot of factors.
Well, I would say anecdotally, for what it's worth, we have been involved in a lot of voucher transplants, and in every case so far, we haven't had the 100% CPRA that you talked about, but in every case so far where we've been involved, the recipient has gotten a kidney within 12 weeks. No guarantee, but that's been our experience.
Yeah, we're hearing that also from even our Kidney for Life centers who have compatible pairs that have entered the exchange to get a better match, and they said they're generally getting matched in 2 to 3 months.
Okay. Next question is, what does it mean to place a donor on DonorShield? I guess, how do you get DonorShield? There's
3 ways now. So the first way is you just participate in an NKR swap. You're either your standard voucher donor, your NDD, whatever, so you're participating in a swap and you automatically get everything. So that's the easy one. Then we went to our transplant centers. Some of our transplant centers said, hey, we really like the support and protection of DonorShield, but we have these direct donation transplants and these donors aren't getting the DonorShield support and protection. And so we created a product called DonorShield Direct. So we have 21 or 22 centers now who, even if you don't go through an NKR swap, you're going to get DonorShield because the hospitals buy that from us directly for their direct donation transplants. Now, the only caveat is that if you do direct donation, you don't get that prioritization protection. You only get that if you go through an NKR swap because we have to have the volume to be able to provide that protection. So it's the DonorShield Direct gets everything except for that prioritization protection. And then there's a third category that we've just opened up. It's the Kidney for Life Direct category. So we have 4 centers right now that are using our expert system, and every donor recipient pair is going through that expert system at those 4 centers. And if we discover that you have a low eplet mismatch with the intended recipient, and physicians say, you know what, we want to do a direct donation transplant because we can't get a better match. That goes through this thing called Kidney for Life internal, and that donor gets everything, including the prioritization protections. So 3 ways in.
Why do some centers appear to be an NKR affiliated center, but they haven't done any transplants utilizing the NKR?
It's a head scratcher, because I guess at one time they thought they would, but we do have a handful of centers that have no activity with us, and we're actually going to start to look at that because we're not necessarily sure that patients and donors are served by having those centers listed as NKR centers and not doing any volume. It probably has something to do with resources, leadership, or whatever, but it really doesn't make a lot of sense that they don't have any activity.
This next question is one that I get quite a lot. As a donor who donated at a non-NKR center and recently learned of the protections of DonorShield, why are there centers not part of the NKR, and how can we advocate to get them part of the NKR so donors receive these protections?
So there's 2 sides of that question. One is that there are some centers who run their own internal paired exchange program, and so they don't want to be involved with national paired exchange for a variety of reasons. We haven't been able to convince them of the side, although we are slowly winning centers like that over. So they don't have a contract with us, they're not working with us, and that's why they don't offer them. Now, having said that, we have made it clear in the industry that we will offer DonorShield Direct to any center, even if it's not an NKR center. We had a couple centers call us on it, but nobody has signed up. So I'm baffled by that too, because there's no other, comprehensive protections out there. And, the donors are what drives the train. There's no living donor transplant industry without donors. And the DonorShield protections and support are a very small cost compared to the revenue on a transplant. So I'm actually surprised that we have centers out there who choose not to be involved with DonorShield, because you don't have to do paired exchange through NKR to utilize DonorShield Direct.
Okay. Next question, if a donor donates through the NKR and receives priority through the NKR, what exactly does priority mean?
So this is for a donor if they ever need a transplant. So that's a great question. Our medical board has identified the priorities. It's on our website. It's the medical board policies. And the first policy on that page is the match offer selection policy. And in that match offer selection policy, we identify exactly what the prioritization is. And you know who's on the top? The living donors. They are absolutely #1 priority. And here's the good news. We have never had a living donor come back and need a transplant. So we had almost 6,000 transplants through the NKR. All those donors got the prioritization protection. Nobody's lost their graft
You've
function.
not had one living donor out of 6,000 who's come back and said, my kidney failed, I need another kidney.
That's correct. Now, we did have one center who came to us and said, we had a donor donated a few years ago. It was a direct donation transplant. And we're like, we can't help you. They didn't come through the NKR. So we know that there's one case where a donor from one of our member centers did need a transplant later on, but not a single NKR donor. Now that's not going to last, because as people age, end-stage renal disease happens later in life. We're probably going to see it, but I'm just very grateful that we've never seen it so far. But that prioritization protection is the #1 priority. The living donors, if they ever need a transplant, they go to the absolute top of the NKR prioritization. They get ahead of everybody else because they're living donors.
Okay. With regard to the Kidney for Life program, the next question is asking you what are the names of those 4 centers?
The 4 centers right now, we have a 5th center coming. Actually, we have a 5th, 6th, and 7th center coming on. But the 4 centers are NYU, Georgetown, University of Minnesota, and Intermount out in Salt Lake. So those 4 centers are leading the charge on eplet matching. But we have 17 centers that are actually doing eplet matching. They're just not doing it on 100% of the donor recipient pairs that are coming through.
Do you anticipate them moving towards that?
I think the whole industry is going to move toward this. As soon as we publish our first paper, and we're just, we're a few months out, we're collecting data now. We're doing antibody screening against every patient that's got a eplet information and was transplanted through us. So we have hundreds of patients now on the data set. We're doing the first prospective multi-center study on de novo DSA in light of the eplet mismatch information.
And I'm sorry, would you just explain for everybody, what does de novo DSA stand for?
So this goes back to Kidney for Life. Kidney for Life, what we want to find low eplet mismatch donors for the patients. And we know that those create a lot less de novo DSA, or maybe even zero. And de novo DSA is the catalyst for chronic rejection, right? You lose your kidney because your immune system wakes up and says, that's a foreign object, and they attack it. And it happens in 63% of graft failure after year one is that. The body's waking up going, that's a foreign object, I'm going to attack it, you lose your kidney. So we have the potential to eliminate that 63% if we can get better matches, right? And that's that in order to understand if the patient is woken up, you have to do what's called an antibody screening test. And if you see that there is an antibody against a mismatched antigen from the transplanted organ, that's a de novo DSA.
So the reason for the term de novo is that you didn't see any evidence of that before the operation.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay.
It's new. And I think it's probably Latin for new.
De novo. That's right. All right. How do transplant centers become part of the NKR?
So we're having conversations with many centers, probably 20 or 30 right now, who are interested in becoming member centers. But, usually we do a presentation, they look at our information, but it's a long decision process for hospitals because it is a change of a lot of the process inside the hospital to support paired exchange.
Well, I know that hospitals like being in charge of their own destiny. They like to set their own policies. And that can sometimes run contrary to the policies that your medical board has established for the industry as a whole. And I imagine that could be an impediment as well.
That's an impediment, but it's as simple as this. If you're trying to do paired exchange and you're inside a single center, it's a lot easier. It's easier. You don't have to work with other centers. You don't have to worry about their policies. You just do it in your own place. But the problem with that is that you can't get the matches. This is a numbers game. And the more numbers you have, the faster you can match the incompatible pairs and the faster you can find a low eplet mismatch for the compatible pairs. So it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off of, doing what's maybe a little easier versus something that's a little harder that gets better results. And then there's also a lot of transplant centers in the United States, probably over 100, that don't do any paired exchange. None. They're too small. They can't support it.
Okay. This next one's kind of tricky. I'd be interested to see how you answer it. Can you explain a situation where decoupling a donor and recipient and entering them into an NKR exchange may not improve the match factor?
Yeah, we actually had one recently. So we had this was a scientist who entered, they needed a kidney and they had a compatible donor. The compatible donor was a low eplet mismatch. And the scientist had done all the research and he said, I want a zero eplet mismatch, which is, the pinnacle. And we find a lot of zero eplet mismatches. The problem is his DNA. It wasn't easy to find a zero eplet for him. And so in his case, we recommended that they didn't decouple, because we didn't want him to give up his donor, which was a low eplet mismatch. So we put him into paired exchange as a pair, looked for a while, and then I think he finally said, you know what, I'm going to just go direct donation because it's not worth, I can't find another donor. It could take too long and I'm on dialysis. And so that's an example of where decoupling may not work.
And this is the one that, based on recent headlines, is on the mind of an awful lot of people. How do you think the breakthroughs around kidneys transplanted from genetically modified pigs will ultimately affect the need for human living kidney donors? And what's the time frame in your mind?
So it's a very exciting area, xenotransplant. And we saw Dr. Montgomery, who's on our medical board, a brilliant physician, I think he did the first one, and then we saw another one in Alabama recently. So this is a Herculean task to be able to take a pig kidney or organ, transplant it into human, and make it work long term. So it's going to be a very slow rollout, and I believe it's going to work. It's going to take a long time, and you're not going to get the kind of outcomes that you're getting right now for human living donor for obvious reasons. It's a different species, right? But there are a lot of people right now who can't get an organ, right? They're stuck on dialysis, or let's say a heart transplant or lung transplant where you don't have dialysis. I think that the xenotransplant is certainly better than the alternative. And so I think that's where it's going to be adopted first. It's these situations where the patient doesn't have any options. So they'll take the additional risk to go down that path. And I think as they do that over time, we'll learn more about it. But it's certainly a long horizon innovation.
Okay, all right. As the better donor recipient matching gets more sophisticated, will very long chains become a thing of the past?
They already have become a thing of the past. So by decoupling pairs, and we just did a medical board call yesterday, and presented a chart that showed that there are now more standard voucher donors than there are paired donors. So it's reversed. Last year it was 60-40, 60% paired donor, 40% standard voucher. Now it's 60% standard voucher, 40% paired donor.
That's a big switch.
Yeah, it's a big switch because people realize that it's better for the donor, it's better for the patient, it's better for the transplant center, and it also is better for the registry, the NKR, because the change is shorter. And when you have a swap failure, you don't lose 8 surgeries. You don't have to reschedule 8 surgeries. A lot of our chains are one deep now, donor to recipient, and so it makes the paired exchange process a lot more reliable. So it's already happened, and our chains are much shorter now. We had the world record of a 35 deep chain that involved 70 people. Not going to happen again.
Right, right. Here's a terminology question. I know this is confusing to a lot of people, as you've got a lot of names for different programs here. But can you explain the Donor Care Network? Why are some centers listed there on that website?
So the Donor Care Network, it was created. It was an outcome of my donation. I went through the process and I thought, some centers don't make it easy to donate a kidney. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to create a group of centers, of elite centers that did the best possible job for the donors. And so, after I donated, I had fresh in my mind, these are all the things that would make it a great experience. And so we put that up on a website. We say, these are the commitments that you as a transplant center have to make to join the Donor Care Network, right? And so it wasn't easy to get the first 5 or 6. Now we have about 20 in the Donor Care Network. And these centers have agreed to step up to this higher level of service to donors. So what do the transplant centers get as a result? Well, about over half of our donor referrals go to those 20 centers, because when donors come to the NKR and they go through our testing process, and we finally go back to, they've done the blood test, and now we say, what center do you want to go to? We identify the centers who are Donor Care Network centers of excellence, and donors generally pick those centers unless they're a long distance from those centers. So our Donor Care Network centers of excellence are getting an enormous number of donor referrals from the NKR. And, so that's sort of the balance. We want those centers to invest in a better service to donors. And, what we're saying is that if you do that, you're going to get a lot more donors coming to you. And that's what's happening.
It's the donation equivalent of the Better Housekeeping Seal of Approval.
It is, yeah.
Okay. If a donor went through a voucher program and it was cashed in by the recipient, would the living donor still be eligible for priority to receive a kidney themselves later in life? It would be the second kidney received after only one donation. I'm having a little hard time with that question.
No, it's a logical question, though. No,
right, go ahead.
So in the voucher program, if a voucher donor donates and somebody gets the voucher and they redeem the voucher and they get a kidney, that's a 1-to-1. One person donated, one person got a kidney.
Right.
But then if the donor loses their kidney function and they come back and they need a kidney, we're definitely going to give them a kidney, right? We're going to allocate. Why? Because it's a donor. Nothing, like that's the highest priority. So in that case, it's 2 for 1. One kidney came into the network and 2 went out.
All right, now let me change that question a little bit because I think this is important. If somebody with a standard voucher gives a standard voucher to a patient, and that patient receives, before he's able to cash in that voucher, he either receives a deceased kidney, or perhaps he passes away, or in some other way becomes ineligible to cash in that voucher. What happens to that standard voucher?
Today, that voucher cannot be reassigned. And that was a medical board policy from like 8 years ago, where the medical board didn't want to be open to vending, buying and selling these vouchers, right? So we said that you cannot make a change to the voucher holder after the donor donates. It's locked in forever. Having said that, we have just cleared an innovation with our medical board, where if you're a standard voucher donor, you're going to go in and you're going to identify a person that's going to get the voucher, but we're also going to let you identify up to 5 family members too, just in case that person gets a deceased donor kidney, they don't redeem their voucher. Now you've got 5 family members that have an active voucher. Now you've protected your family. So that's coming in the next 2 months.
Okay. All right. I've got time for one more question here. I am a non-directed donor and I'm going to participate in the family voucher program. Why are my named voucher holders being asked to provide a cheek swab and blood and urine now, even though they may never need a kidney?
So that goes back to the vending issue. So our medical board, very concerned about being able to buy and sell vouchers, right? So we require all voucher holders to do a cheek swab, so we have their DNA. Because 30 years from now, they may look totally different than they look now, even though we have their ID, especially, if you're younger, whatever. We have your DNA. So when you come back to say, hey, I am a voucher holder, we then do another cheek swab and we know you're you, right? Because you can't fake that, the DNA. So that's why we do the cheek swab. There's a separate test, which is it's like a blood test or whatever. That's a second test to determine the overall health of the voucher holder pool, so that we know the liability inherent in that voucher holder pool. So the cheek swab is for identification, and the labs, the blood test, is so that we can take a look at the voucher pool and understand the risk profile of the voucher pool.
Okay, well, Garet, I can't thank you enough for being the first expert interviewee of our program here. And I can't thank the donors and the recipients and the interested parties who joined the NKDO team. And I appreciate all your time. Thank you.
All right, these are great questions, by the way.
All right, goodbye.
Thank you.